The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace, as Captain James Morrison adjusted his red ceremonial jacket for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold London air that seeped through the ancient windows, but from the weight of the task that lay ahead. After 23 years of loyal service to the crown, he had never imagined he would find himself in such a position. The previous evening had been unlike any other in the palace's recent history. Emergency meetings had been called behind closed doors, with senior officials whispering in hushed tones throughout the corridors. Something had gone terribly wrong with the preparations for Queen Camilla's upcoming state visit to France, and Morrison had been specifically chosen to handle what palace insiders were calling a delicate matter of national importance. Lord Chamberlain Sir Edward Whitmore had briefed Morrison personally, his weathered face grave with concern. The Queen's coronation garment, a priceless ceremonial robe that had been worn by British royalty for over 3 centuries, had apparently gone missing from the royal wardrobe. More troubling still, there were whispers that it might have been deliberately hidden or even stolen from within the palace walls. Morrison walked through the East Wing's portrait gallery, his polished boots echoing against the hardwood floors. Portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch his every move, their painted eyes following him as he made his way toward the Queen's private chambers. The responsibility weighing on his shoulders felt enormous. This wasn't just about finding a missing piece of clothing. It was about protecting the dignity and security of the monarchy itself. The Queen's personal wardrobe was located in a secured section of her private apartments, protected by multiple layers of security that had never before been breached. Access required special clearance, biometric identification, and the presence of at least 2 senior palace officials. Under normal circumstances, even the most trusted guards were forbidden from entering without explicit royal permission. As Morrison approached the secured corridor, he encountered Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the Queen's longest-serving lady-in-waiting. Her silver hair was pulled back in its customary tight bun, but her usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept, and her hands fidgeted nervously with the pearl necklace she always wore. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation. Her Majesty is currently attending morning prayers and remains unaware of our predicament. We must resolve this matter before she returns." Morrison nodded solemnly. He had worked alongside Mrs. Hartwell on numerous occasions, and had always found her to be utterly professional and devoted to the royal family. Seeing her in such distress only reinforced the seriousness of their current crisis. The security checkpoint outside the Queen's wardrobe required Morrison to place his hand on a biometric scanner while simultaneously entering a 12-digit code that changed daily. The heavy steel door, disguised behind elegant mahogany paneling, clicked open with a soft mechanical hum. Beyond lay a climate-controlled chamber that housed some of the most valuable clothing and jewelry in the world. The wardrobe itself was a marvel of organization and preservation technology. Rows upon rows of garments hung in perfect alignment, each piece carefully catalogued and maintained at precise temperature and humidity levels. Gowns worn by Queen Elizabeth II, ceremonial uniforms from various state occasions, and priceless jewelry collections were all meticulously arranged according to a system that had been developed over decades. Morrison's trained eye immediately began scanning the area where the coronation garment should have been displayed. The space was there, clearly marked with a brass nameplate, but it stood empty. The velvet-lined case that should have contained the ancient robe was nowhere to be seen. More concerning still, there were no signs of forced entry or disturbance that might suggest an external theft. Mrs. Hartwell joined him inside the wardrobe, her face pale with worry. "It was definitely here 3 days ago," she said, pointing to the empty display case. "I personally supervised its cleaning and preparation for the upcoming ceremony. Everything was in perfect order." Morrison examined the surrounding area more closely. The security cameras that monitored the wardrobe had mysteriously malfunctioned during a brief period 2 nights earlier, creating a window of approximately 47 minutes during which no footage was recorded. The timing seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. As they searched through the meticulously organized sections of the wardrobe, Morrison began to notice other subtle irregularities. Several other items appeared to have been moved slightly from their usual positions, suggesting that someone had been searching through the collection. A few jewelry boxes showed fingerprints that didn't match the usual cleaning staff patterns, and one of the climate control panels had been recently adjusted. The most disturbing discovery came when Morrison examined the wardrobe's access logs. The electronic records showed that someone had entered the secured area using legitimate credentials just hours after the security cameras had malfunctioned. However, the identity associated with the access code belonged to a staff member who had been verified to be off-duty and at home during that time period. Mrs. Hartwell gasped when Morrison showed her the access records. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Sarah Jenkins has been with us for 15 years. She would never." But how could someone else have used her credentials? The implications were becoming increasingly clear and troubling. This wasn't a random theft by an outsider, but rather an inside job orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the palace's security systems. The missing coronation garment was likely just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy that threatened to shake the very foundations of the royal household. Morrison realized that his mission had evolved far beyond simply locating a missing ceremonial robe. He was now investigating what appeared to be a carefully planned operation designed to compromise the monarchy's most sacred traditions. The coronation garment wasn't just valuable, it was irreplaceable, carrying centuries of history and symbolic importance that couldn't be measured in monetary terms. As morning turned to afternoon, Morrison knew that time was running short. The Queen would soon return from her engagements, and the upcoming state visit to France was only days away. Without the coronation garment, the carefully planned ceremonies would have to be dramatically altered, potentially causing diplomatic embarrassment and raising uncomfortable questions about palace security. The captain took a deep breath and prepared himself for what would likely be the most challenging investigation of his distinguished career. Somewhere within the palace walls, someone was playing a dangerous game with the crown's most precious treasures, and Morrison was determined to uncover the truth before irreparable damage was done to the institution he had sworn to protect. Captain Morrison spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting discreet interviews with palace staff members who had access to the Queen's private apartments. His years of experience in security investigations had taught him to look beyond the obvious suspects and pay attention to subtle changes in behavior and routine. The first person on his list was Thomas Ashford, the head butler, who had served the royal family for over 30 years. Morrison found him in the silver pantry, meticulously polishing ceremonial serving pieces that would be used for the upcoming state dinner. Thomas's weathered hands moved with practiced precision, but Morrison noticed the slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Ashford," Morrison began carefully, "I'm investigating some irregularities in the palace security systems. I need to ask you about your activities over the past few days." Thomas paused in his polishing, his gray eyes meeting Morrison's directly. "Captain, I've heard whispers about something being amiss. If there's anything I can do to help, you have my complete cooperation." His voice carried the weight of decades of loyal service, but Morrison detected an underlying tension that seemed unusual for the normally unflappable butler. During their conversation, Morrison learned that Thomas had noticed several staff members working unusual hours over the past week. Kitchen staff had been seen in corridors where they normally wouldn't venture, and cleaning crews had been observed in areas that weren't on their regular schedules. Most intriguingly, Thomas had spotted Sarah Jenkins, whose security credentials had been mysteriously used, entering the East Wing well past her normal working hours on 2 separate occasions. Morrison made careful notes while maintaining a casual demeanor. Palace protocol required that any investigation be conducted with absolute discretion to avoid panic among the staff or, worse yet, media attention that could damage the monarchy's reputation. The captain knew that news of a theft from the Queen's personal wardrobe would create a scandal of unprecedented proportions. His next interview was with Margaret Collins, the senior housekeeping supervisor who oversaw the cleaning and maintenance of the royal apartments. Margaret had been with the palace for 18 years and was known for her exceptional attention to detail and unwavering loyalty. However, when Morrison approached her in the linen storage room, he immediately noticed that she seemed unusually nervous. "Mrs. Collins," Morrison said, settling into a chair across from where she was organizing towels, "I'm reviewing our security procedures and need to understand the normal patterns of staff movement throughout the palace." Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Margaret's hands continued folding linens, but Morrison observed that her movements had become more rigid and mechanical. Well, Captain, she began hesitantly, there have been some changes in our cleaning schedules lately. We've had several requests from senior staff to clean certain areas at odd hours, particularly around Her Majesty's private chambers. This revelation immediately caught Morrison's attention. He pressed gently for more details, and Margaret revealed that she had received written instructions to have her team clean the Queen's wardrobe area 3 nights ago, well outside their normal routine. The instructions had come through official channels and bore the proper authorization codes, so she had complied without question. The strange thing was, Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, when my team arrived to do the cleaning, they found that the area had already been thoroughly cleaned. Everything was spotless, as if someone had been there just hours before. But according to our schedules, no cleaning was supposed to have taken place. Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Someone had orchestrated a complex plan that involved manipulating staff schedules, security systems, and cleaning routines. The level of inside knowledge required suggested that the perpetrator was either a long-term staff member or someone with access to highly confidential palace operations. As the afternoon progressed, Morrison interviewed several more staff members, including security guards, kitchen personnel, and maintenance workers. A pattern began to emerge of small irregularities and unusual requests that, individually, seemed insignificant but collectively painted a picture of careful manipulation and planning. The most revealing conversation came with David Fletcher, a junior security guard who worked the night shifts in the East Wing. David was relatively new to the palace, having been hired just 6 months earlier, but his military background and attention to detail had quickly earned him the respect of his supervisors. Captain Morrison, David said when they met in a small security office, I've been wanting to report something, but I wasn't sure if it was important enough to bother anyone. During my patrol 2 nights ago, I noticed that one of the corridor lights near the Queen's apartments was flickering. When I went to check it, I heard voices coming from the wardrobe area. Morrison leaned forward, his interest intensified. What kind of voices? Could you make out what they were saying? David shook his head. It was too muffled to understand the words, but I could tell there were at least 2 people talking. What struck me as odd was the timing. It was well past midnight, and according to the duty roster, no one should have been in that area. I almost went to investigate, but then I received a radio call about a disturbance in the West Wing that required my immediate attention. This detail added another layer of complexity to Morrison's investigation. The disturbance in the West Wing had likely been a deliberate distraction, designed to draw security personnel away from the real activity taking place near the Queen's wardrobe. The level of coordination required indicated that multiple people were involved in whatever was happening. Morrison spent the early evening reviewing security footage from cameras throughout the palace, focusing on the periods surrounding the mysterious wardrobe access. While the cameras monitoring the wardrobe itself had malfunctioned, other cameras in adjacent corridors had continued functioning normally. By carefully analyzing the footage, he was able to identify several individuals moving through areas where they wouldn't normally be expected. The most significant discovery came when Morrison spotted Sarah Jenkins on camera footage from a corridor near the Queen's apartments. Despite the fact that she had supposedly been at home during that time, the timestamp showed her presence just minutes before someone had used her security credentials to access the wardrobe. However, something about her appearance struck Morrison as unusual. Her posture and gait seemed different from her normal demeanor. As Morrison studied the footage more closely, he realized what had been bothering him. The person on camera appeared to be slightly taller than Sarah Jenkins, and their walking pattern didn't match her characteristic slightly favored left leg, the result of an old injury that Morrison remembered from previous encounters. This revelation transformed Morrison's understanding of the case entirely. Someone had not only stolen Sarah's security credentials, but had also attempted to impersonate her physically. The operation was far more sophisticated than he had initially believed, involving identity theft, security manipulation, and careful timing to avoid detection. Morrison realized he was dealing with professionals who had studied the palace's routines and personnel with extraordinary attention to detail. The missing coronation garment was likely part of a larger plan, possibly involving multiple thefts or some form of blackmail against the royal family. As evening approached and the palace settled into its nighttime routines, Morrison prepared for what he suspected would be a long night of investigation. He had uncovered evidence of a complex conspiracy, but the identity of the actual perpetrators remained elusive. More importantly, the priceless coronation garment was still missing, and time was running out before its absence would become impossible to hide. Morrison knew that his next steps would be crucial. He needed to trace the movements of the fake Sarah Jenkins, identify her accomplices, and recover the stolen garment before the Queen's upcoming public appearances made the theft impossible to conceal. The reputation of the monarchy itself hung in the balance. Captain Morrison decided to pay an unexpected visit to Sarah Jenkins at her home that evening. The real Sarah lived in a modest flat in South London, about 45 minutes from the palace by underground. Morrison traveled in civilian clothes, taking extra precautions to ensure he wasn't followed or observed by anyone who might be monitoring his investigation. Sarah's building was a converted Victorian house divided into several small apartments. Morrison climbed 2 flights of creaking stairs to reach her door on the second floor. When Sarah answered his knock, her face immediately showed concern at seeing the captain at such an unusual hour. "Captain Morrison, is everything all right at the palace?" Sarah asked, wrapping a worn cardigan more tightly around herself. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the comfortable clothes of someone who had been relaxing at home for the evening. Morrison studied her carefully, noting her height, posture, and the slight favor she gave to her left leg when walking. She was definitely shorter than the person he had seen on the security footage, confirming his suspicions about the impersonation. "Sarah, I need to ask you some important questions about your security credentials," Morrison said gently. "May I come in? This is a matter of palace security, and I need your complete honesty." Sarah's eyes widened with worry, but she immediately stepped aside to let him enter. Her small flat was neat and tidy, decorated with photographs of her grandchildren and souvenirs from palace events she had worked over the years. Everything about her living situation reinforced Morrison's belief that she was not involved in any theft or conspiracy. "Sarah," Morrison began, settling into a chair she offered him, "when was the last time you remember having your security badge and access cards?" Sarah thought for a moment, then walked to a small table near the entrance where she kept her keys and work items. "They should be right here in my work bag," she said, rummaging through a leather satchel. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she searched. "They're gone, Captain. I always keep them in this same pocket, but they're not here." Morrison felt a surge of satisfaction at having his theory confirmed, but he also realized this meant the conspiracy was even more sophisticated than he had imagined. "When do you remember last seeing them?" "Yesterday morning when I left for work," Sarah replied, her voice growing worried. "I used them to enter the staff entrance as always. But now that I think about it, I had lunch in the staff cafeteria and I left my bag on the table when I went to get tea. Someone could have taken them then." This timeline fit perfectly with Morrison's understanding of events. Someone had stolen Sarah's credentials during her lunch break, used them that same evening to access the Queen's wardrobe, and then managed to return them to her bag before she noticed they were missing. Except the plan had been disrupted by Sarah calling in sick the next day, preventing the credentials from being returned. Morrison spent another hour with Sarah, gathering details about her routines, who might have observed her daily patterns, and whether she had noticed anyone paying unusual attention to her recently. Sarah was cooperative and clearly distressed about the idea that her security credentials had been misused. "There is one thing," Sarah said as Morrison prepared to leave. "About a week ago, I noticed a new cleaning lady asking me questions about the palace layout. She said she was trying to learn the most efficient routes for her work, but some of her questions seemed oddly specific about areas where cleaning staff don't normally go." Morrison immediately became alert. "Can you describe this person? Do you remember her name?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She was tall, probably in her 30s, with dark hair usually pulled back in a bun. She said her name was Helen, but I never saw her again after that one conversation. I assumed she had been assigned to a different section of the palace. This description matched the height and build of the person Morrison had seen on the security footage using Sarah's credentials. The mysterious Helen had clearly been gathering intelligence about palace operations, studying Sarah's routines, and planning the theft well in advance. Morrison returned to the palace late that evening with a much clearer understanding of how the theft had been executed. However, he still needed to identify the real culprits and locate the missing coronation garment. The fake cleaning lady Helen was obviously a key figure, but she had likely been working with others inside the palace who could provide access and information. Back at the palace, Morrison decided to review personnel records for any new employees who might fit Helen's description. The Human Resources Office kept detailed files on all staff members, including photographs, background checks, and employment histories. Morrison spent several hours going through recent hires, looking for anyone who might be working under false pretenses. His search proved fruitful when he discovered that a cleaning contractor had been hired temporarily to cover staff shortages during the past month. The contractor, Madison Cleaning Services, had provided several workers, including a woman named Helen Crawford, whose photograph showed a striking resemblance to Sarah's description. Morrison immediately began investigating Madison Cleaning Services and quickly discovered irregularities in their business registration and references. The company appeared to have been created recently, specifically for the purpose of placing workers inside the palace. Their business address led to a vacant office building, and their references were either disconnected, phone numbers, or businesses that claimed no knowledge of Madison Cleaning. This discovery revealed that Morrison was dealing with an organized criminal operation that had gone to extraordinary lengths to infiltrate palace security. The theft of the coronation garment was not an opportunistic crime, but rather a carefully planned heist that had required months of preparation and significant resources. Morrison realized he needed backup and additional expertise to handle such a sophisticated criminal enterprise. However, palace protocol required that he maintain absolute secrecy about the investigation until he could present a complete case to his superiors. Any premature disclosure could result in media attention that would damage the monarchy's reputation, regardless of the investigation's outcome. The captain decided to focus his immediate efforts on tracking down Helen Crawford and any accomplices who might still be working within the palace. He began by reviewing all security footage from the past month, looking for appearances by Helen and trying to identify anyone she had been in contact with during her time at the palace. This painstaking review revealed that Helen had indeed been gathering intelligence systematically. She had been observed in conversation with various staff members, always asking questions about schedules, security procedures, and access protocols. More concerning, she had been seen speaking with several long-term employees who had access to sensitive areas of the palace. One conversation that particularly caught Morrison's attention involved Helen speaking with Marcus Webb, a maintenance supervisor who had been with the palace for 12 years. Marcus had access to virtually every area of the building, including the Queen's private apartments, and his sterling reputation had never given anyone reason for suspicion. Morrison reviewed Marcus's recent activities and discovered some troubling patterns. Marcus had requested overtime work on several occasions that corresponded with times when irregular activities had been observed around the palace. He had also submitted maintenance requests for areas that didn't appear to need any work, possibly as a way to gain legitimate access to secured locations. The pieces of the conspiracy were beginning to form a clearer picture, but Morrison realized that time was running critically short. The Queen's state visit to France was now only 2 days away, and the missing coronation garment would need to be recovered immediately to avoid a diplomatic disaster. Morrison spent the remainder of the night developing a strategy to confront Marcus Webb without alerting other potential conspirators. He would need to be extremely careful, as any misstep could result in the destruction of evidence or the permanent loss of the priceless coronation garment. The pressure was mounting, and Morrison knew that his next moves would determine whether he could successfully resolve the crisis or whether the scandal would explode into public view. The next morning brought an unexpected development that changed everything about Morrison's investigation. As he prepared to confront Marcus Webb, Mrs. Hartwell appeared at his office door with an expression of barely controlled panic. Her usually perfect composure had cracked, and her hands shook as she held a small envelope. "Captain Morrison," she whispered urgently, "this was slipped under the Queen's private study door sometime during the night. No one saw who delivered it, and the security cameras show nothing unusual." Morrison carefully took the envelope, noting that it bore no postmark or external identifying marks. Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper with a typed message that made his blood run cold. The coronation garment will be returned unharmed in exchange for $2 million in untraceable currency. Further instructions will follow. Any attempt to involve outside authorities will result in the permanent disappearance of this irreplaceable artifact. The transformation from theft to extortion changed the entire dynamic of Morrison's investigation. This was no longer just about recovering stolen property. It was about preventing a ransom situation that could set a dangerous precedent for future attacks on the royal family. The criminals had escalated their crime into something that could potentially fund much larger operations. Morrison immediately recognized that the ransom demand confirmed several of his suspicions about the sophistication of the criminal organization. The amount requested was substantial, but not so large as to be impossible for the crown to pay. More importantly, the demand for untraceable currency indicated that the perpetrators understood international finance and money laundering techniques. Mrs. Hartwell wrung her hands nervously as Morrison studied the ransom note. "What are we going to do, Captain? Her Majesty cannot be told about this. The stress would be overwhelming, especially with the state visit approaching. And if word of this reaches the media," Morrison nodded grimly, "the implications extended far beyond the immediate crisis. If news of the theft and ransom demand became public, it would raise serious questions about palace security and potentially inspire copycat crimes. The royal family's safety and dignity depended on resolving this situation quietly and completely. Mrs. Hartwell," Morrison said carefully, "we need to buy time while I continue the investigation. Can the Queen's schedule be adjusted to avoid any immediate need for the coronation garment?" Mrs. Hartwell consulted her notebook, her face growing more strained. "The ceremonial robe was scheduled to be worn during the welcome ceremony at the French embassy tomorrow evening. It's a crucial part of the diplomatic protocol, and any substitution would be noticed immediately by both the French delegation and the British media." Morrison realized he had less than 36 hours to resolve the situation. The pressure was enormous, but his military training and years of security experience had prepared him for high-stakes operations. He decided to accelerate his investigation while simultaneously preparing contingency plans. His first priority was to secretly observe Marcus Webb's activities and try to catch him in contact with his accomplices. Morrison positioned himself strategically where he could monitor the maintenance supervisor without being detected. He didn't have to wait long before his patience was rewarded. Around mid-morning, Morrison watched Marcus receive a phone call that clearly agitated him. After ending the call, Marcus quickly left his normal work area and headed toward a section of the palace that housed storage rooms and utility areas. Morrison followed at a distance, using his knowledge of the building's layout to remain concealed while keeping Marcus in sight. Marcus entered a storage room that was rarely used, located in a basement area beneath the east wing. Morrison waited several minutes before carefully approaching the door, which Marcus had left slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could hear Marcus speaking in hushed but urgent tones to someone else inside the room. "The pressure is getting too intense," Marcus was saying. "That guard captain is asking too many questions, and some of the staff are getting nervous. Maybe we should just return the thing and disappear." A woman's voice, which Morrison recognized as belonging to Helen Crawford, responded with irritation. "We've invested too much time and money in this operation to back out now. The ransom note was delivered, and they'll pay rather than risk the scandal. We just need to stay calm for one more day." Morrison strained to hear more of their conversation while carefully positioning himself to observe the storage room's interior. Through the crack in the door, he could see both Marcus and Helen along with a third person whose back was turned toward the door. The storage room appeared to have been converted into a temporary headquarters, with maps of the palace layout spread on a table and what looked like communication equipment. "The captain suspects something," Marcus continued nervously. "He's been reviewing security footage and asking questions about cleaning schedules. If he traces the fake cleaning company back to us..." Helen's voice cut him off sharply. "That's why we have contingency plans. If the investigation gets too close, we disappear, and the coronation garment disappears with us. They'll never risk the embarrassment of admitting they lost a piece of British history." Morrison felt a chill at Helen's words. The criminals were prepared to destroy the priceless artifact rather than be caught, which raised the stakes beyond simple theft or extortion. The coronation garment represented centuries of royal tradition and could never be replaced. The third person in the room finally turned around, and Morrison was shocked to recognize Patricia Somerville, a senior administrative assistant who had been with the palace for over 15 years. Patricia had access to high-level scheduling information, personnel records, and security protocols. Her involvement explained how the criminals had obtained such detailed inside information about palace operations. "Patricia," Helen continued, "you need to monitor the captain's activities and report back immediately if he gets too close to discovering our location. Use your administrative access to track his movements and communication." Patricia nodded reluctantly, her face showing signs of severe stress. "I never thought it would go this far," she said quietly. "When you first approached me about selling some information, you said it was just corporate espionage. Now we're talking about destroying historical artifacts." Morrison realized that Patricia had likely been recruited gradually, probably starting with seemingly innocent requests for information that slowly escalated into more serious crimes. Her obvious discomfort suggested she might be willing to cooperate if approached correctly. Helen's response was cold and threatening. "You're in too deep to have second thoughts now, Patricia. If this operation fails, you'll go down with the rest of us. But if we succeed, you'll have enough money to disappear permanently." Morrison had heard enough to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. He now knew the identities of the main perpetrators, their location, and their plans. However, he still needed to discover where they were hiding the coronation garment and how they planned to collect the ransom without being caught. More importantly, Morrison realized that Patricia's reluctant participation might provide an opportunity to end the crisis without violence or permanent loss of the artifact. If he could approach her carefully and offer her a way out of the situation, she might be willing to help recover the stolen garment and testify against her accomplices. Morrison quietly retreated from the storage room area and began developing a plan to resolve the crisis. He would need to move quickly and carefully, balancing the need to recover the coronation garment with the necessity of preventing the criminals from escaping or destroying evidence. The next several hours would be crucial in determining whether Morrison could successfully end the conspiracy and protect the reputation of the monarchy, or whether the scandal would explode into international headlines that could damage the crown standing for generations to come. Captain Morrison spent the early afternoon developing a careful strategy to approach Patricia Somerville without alerting her accomplices. He knew that any misstep could result in the criminals destroying the coronation garment or escalating to violence. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required patience, preparation, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Morrison decided to wait until Patricia returned to her normal work duties before making contact. He positioned himself where he could observe her movements and identify when she would be alone and vulnerable to approach. Around 3 o'clock, Patricia emerged from the storage room area and returned to her administrative office in the West Wing. Morrison watched Patricia's behavior carefully as she attempted to resume her normal duties. Her hands trembled as she tried to type on her computer, and she frequently looked over her shoulder as if expecting to be discovered. The stress of participating in the conspiracy was clearly taking a severe toll on her mental state. When Patricia left her office to visit the staff restroom, Morrison saw his opportunity. He intercepted her in the corridor, speaking in a calm and reassuring tone. "Patricia, I need to speak with you privately. It's about the situation you've become involved in." Patricia's face went pale, and for a moment Morrison thought she might faint. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her voice lacked any conviction. Morrison gently guided her into an empty conference room and closed the door. "Patricia, I know about Marcus, Helen, and the coronation garment. I also know that you didn't intend for things to go this far. I'm here to offer you a way out of this situation." Tears began streaming down Patricia's face as the weight of her situation became clear. "They said it would just be selling some scheduling information," she whispered. "I needed the money for my mother's medical treatments. But then they wanted more and more information, and before I knew it, I was helping them plan a theft." Morrison sat across from Patricia, his voice remaining calm and supportive. "Patricia, you're not beyond help, but time is running very short. The Queen's state visit is tomorrow, and this situation needs to be resolved before then. If you help me recover the coronation garment and stop your accomplices, I can ensure that your cooperation is taken into account." Patricia looked up at Morrison with desperate hope in her eyes. "They have the garment hidden in a storage unit outside London. Helen said they chose the location specifically because it's far from the palace and has minimal security cameras. But Captain, they're planning something else. The ransom demand was just a distraction." This revelation sent a chill through Morrison. "What do you mean it was a distraction? What are they really planning?" Patricia wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Tomorrow, during the Queen's state visit preparations, they're planning to steal several other items from the royal collection. The chaos from the missing coronation garment will provide cover for them to access other secured areas while security is focused on the ransom situation." Morrison realized he had been dealing with an even more ambitious criminal operation than he had imagined. The theft of the coronation garment was just the first phase of a larger heist that could result in the loss of multiple priceless artifacts. The criminals had planned to use the initial theft as a diversion while they executed their main objectives. "Patricia," Morrison said urgently, "I need you to tell me everything about their plans. Where are they storing the other stolen items? How many people are involved? What's their timeline for tomorrow?" Over the next hour, Patricia provided Morrison with detailed information about the criminal conspiracy. The operation involved at least 6 people, including Helen Crawford, Marcus Webb, and 3 outside accomplices who specialized in art theft and international smuggling. They had been planning the operation for over 8 months, carefully studying palace security and identifying the most valuable and portable items in the royal collection. The storage unit where the coronation garment was hidden was located in a facility about 50 miles outside London. Helen had rented it under a false identity and paid for several months in advance to avoid suspicion. The unit also contained equipment and supplies that would be used in tomorrow's expanded theft operations. More concerning, Patricia revealed that the criminals had identified security vulnerabilities in several areas of the palace that had never been properly addressed. They knew about blind spots in camera coverage, staff schedule patterns that created opportunities for unauthorized access, and even backup security codes that could be used if primary systems were disabled. Morrison realized that resolving this crisis would require not just recovering the stolen coronation garment but also preventing a much larger theft that could permanently damage the royal collection. The criminals had to be stopped before they could execute their expanded plans, but any premature action could result in the destruction of evidence and the loss of already stolen items. "Patricia," Morrison said carefully, "I need your help to stop them, but it has to appear that you're still cooperating with their plans. Can you handle that level of pressure?" Patricia nodded with determination that surprised Morrison. "I've been living with this fear for weeks. If there's a chance to make things right, I'll do whatever is necessary." Morrison and Patricia spent the remainder of the afternoon developing a plan to trap the criminals while recovering the stolen coronation garment. Patricia would continue to appear cooperative while secretly providing Morrison with information about the criminals' movements and communications. She would also help Morrison gain access to their storage room headquarters when the timing was optimal. The most challenging aspect of the plan was coordinating the recovery of the coronation garment from the off-site storage unit while simultaneously preventing the criminals from executing their expanded theft plans at the palace. Morrison would need to split his attention between 2 locations and ensure that neither operation was compromised. As evening approached, Morrison received word that Helen had contacted Patricia about final preparations for tomorrow's operations. The criminals were planning to begin their expanded theft during the early morning hours, taking advantage of the reduced security presence that occurred during shift changes. Morrison realized he would have to act that night to prevent tomorrow's larger heist. He couldn't risk allowing the criminals to steal additional artifacts, especially since some of the items they had targeted were even more valuable and historically significant than the coronation garment. Patricia provided Morrison with the address of the storage facility and detailed information about the security measures Helen had described. The facility was relatively isolated, with minimal staffing during nighttime hours and older security systems that could be circumvented with proper preparation. Morrison began assembling the resources he would need for a coordinated operation to recover the coronation garment and arrest the criminals. However, he was still bound by palace protocol to maintain absolute secrecy about the investigation. Any involvement of outside law enforcement could result in media exposure that would damage the monarchy regardless of the operation's success. The captain realized he would have to execute the most challenging operation of his career with minimal backup and support. The pressure was enormous, but the stakes were too high to accept failure. Tomorrow's state visit and the reputation of the monarchy itself depended on his ability to successfully resolve the crisis. As Morrison prepared for what would likely be a dangerous nighttime operation, he reflected on the complexity of the criminal conspiracy he had uncovered. The theft of the coronation garment had revealed security vulnerabilities and organizational weaknesses that would need to be addressed to prevent future attacks. But first, he had to ensure that this immediate crisis was resolved without permanent damage to the crown's most precious treasures. Captain Morrison spent the evening hours carefully preparing for the most critical operation of his career. Working from his private office, he assembled the equipment and resources he would need to simultaneously recover the stolen coronation garment and prevent the larger theft planned for the following morning. The complexity of coordinating two separate operations while maintaining absolute secrecy presented challenges. Unlike anything he had faced before, Morrison's first priority was establishing secure communication with Patricia Somerville, who had agreed to continue appearing cooperative with her accomplices while secretly providing him with real-time intelligence. They developed a system of coded text messages that would allow Patricia to update Morrison on the criminal's activities without arousing suspicion. Around 10 o'clock that evening, Patricia sent Morrison a message indicating that Helen and Marcus were preparing to leave the palace to make final preparations at their off-site storage unit. This presented Morrison with the perfect opportunity to follow them and locate the coronation garment while they were away from their palace headquarters. Morrison changed into dark civilian clothing and equipped himself with night vision equipment, a small camera for evidence collection, and communication gear that would allow him to maintain contact with Patricia. He also carried lock-picking tools and electronic devices that could help him gain access to the storage facility without triggering security alarms. The storage facility was located in an industrial area outside London, surrounded by similar businesses that were closed during nighttime hours. Morrison arrived about 30 minutes after Helen and Marcus, giving them time to settle into whatever activities they had planned while allowing him to observe their movements and security precautions. The facility consisted of several long buildings containing hundreds of individual storage units, each accessed through roll-up metal doors. Morrison used his night vision equipment to identify which unit Helen and Marcus had entered, noting that they had parked their vehicle in a location that provided quick access to the main road, while being partially concealed from the facility's security cameras. Morrison waited patiently for over an hour, observing the criminals' activities and mapping out the facility's security measures. The storage facility had minimal nighttime staffing, with just one security guard who spent most of his time in a small office near the entrance. The perimeter was monitored by older security cameras that had significant blind spots, particularly in the area where Helen and Marcus had parked. Around midnight, Morrison observed Helen and Marcus leaving their storage unit and driving away from the facility. Their departure provided him with the opportunity he had been waiting for, but he knew he would have to work quickly before they returned or became suspicious about his activities. Morrison approached the storage unit using a route that avoided the security cameras, moving carefully through the shadows between buildings. The unit's roll-up door was secured with a heavy-duty lock, but Morrison's experience with security systems allowed him to defeat it within a few minutes without leaving obvious signs of tampering. Inside the storage unit, Morrison discovered a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple theft. The space had been converted into a temporary headquarters complete with computers, communication equipment, detailed maps of the palace, and surveillance photographs of various staff members and security personnel. Most importantly, Morrison found the coronation garment carefully wrapped and stored in a climate-controlled container that had been specifically designed to preserve historical textiles. The criminals had clearly taken extraordinary precautions to prevent any damage to the priceless artifact. suggesting that they understood its irreplaceable historical value. Morrison quickly photographed everything in the storage unit before carefully removing the coronation garment and several boxes of documents that appeared to contain evidence of the broader conspiracy. He was particularly interested in files that seemed to detail other royal collections and museums that had been targeted for future theft operations. However, as Morrison prepared to leave the storage unit, he received an urgent text message from Patricia indicating that Helen and Marcus were returning to the palace earlier than expected. Morrison realized he would have to accelerate his timeline and return to the palace immediately to prevent the larger theft operation from proceeding. Morrison carefully secured the storage unit to avoid leaving obvious evidence of his presence, then quickly returned to his vehicle with the recovered coronation garment. During the drive back to London, he maintained communication with Patricia, who reported that Helen and Marcus had returned to their palace headquarters and were making final preparations for the morning operation. Arriving back at the palace around 2 in the morning, Morrison faced the challenging task of preventing the expanded theft while protecting Patricia's safety and maintaining the secrecy that palace protocol required. He knew that Helen and Marcus would become suspicious if their carefully laid plans began falling apart, potentially putting Patricia at risk. Morrison decided to use the criminals' own tactics against them by creating diversions and disruptions that would prevent them from executing their plans without making it obvious that their operation had been discovered. He began by subtly sabotaging some of the equipment they had prepared and altering security schedules in ways that would block their access to targeted areas. Around 4 in the morning, Patricia sent Morrison a message indicating that Helen was becoming agitated about various small problems that were interfering with their preparations. Security cameras that should have been disabled were still functioning. Access codes that should have worked were mysteriously changed, and staff members were present in areas where the criminals had expected to work unobserved. Morrison continued his subtle sabotage operations while positioning himself to observe the criminals' reactions and be ready to intervene if they became violent or threatened Patricia's safety. The psychological pressure of having their carefully planned operation fall apart was clearly affecting both Helen and Marcus, who were beginning to suspect that their conspiracy had been discovered. By 6 in the morning, it became clear that the criminals' expanded theft operation had been effectively prevented. Their frustration and paranoia had reached a breaking point, and Morrison observed them beginning to pack their equipment and prepare to abandon their palace headquarters. Morrison realized that this was the moment to act decisively. The criminals were preparing to flee, but they might still pose a threat to Patricia or attempt to cause damage to the palace out of spite. He needed to coordinate their arrest while ensuring that all evidence was preserved and that no harm came to anyone in the palace. Patricia sent Morrison a final message indicating that Helen and Marcus were planning to leave the palace within the next hour. They had apparently decided that their operation had been compromised and were preparing to disappear permanently rather than risk being caught. Morrison knew that allowing the criminals to escape would create ongoing security risks for the royal family and potentially enable them to target other institutions in the future. However, arresting them would require involving outside law enforcement and potentially exposing the entire incident to public scrutiny. As dawn broke over London, Morrison prepared to make the critical decisions that would determine how this extraordinary crisis would be resolved. The coronation garment had been recovered safely, but the broader implications of the criminal conspiracy would require careful handling to protect both the monarchy's security and its public reputation. As the first light of dawn illuminated the palace corridors, Captain Morrison made the decision that would define the resolution of the most complex security crisis in recent royal history. Rather than risk a confrontation that could endanger palace staff or result in public exposure, he chose to orchestrate a carefully controlled conclusion that would protect both the monarchy and the evidence needed for future prosecutions. Morrison contacted Lord Chamberlain Sir Edward Whitmore using secure communication channels, requesting an immediate private meeting to report the successful recovery of the coronation garment and provide a full briefing on the criminal conspiracy. The Lord Chamberlain arrived at Morrison's office within 20 minutes, his face showing both relief and concern about the implications of what had transpired. "Captain Morrison," Sir Edward said as he examined the recovered coronation garment, "your discretion and professionalism in handling this crisis has been exemplary. However, we now face the challenge of ensuring that such a security breach never occurs again while avoiding any public disclosure that could damage the Crown's reputation." Morrison presented Sir Edward with the extensive evidence he had collected, including photographs from the criminal storage unit, documentation of their expanded theft plans, and detailed information about the security vulnerabilities they had exploited. The scope of the conspiracy was even more extensive than Sir Edward had initially realized. Meanwhile, Patricia Somerville continued monitoring Helen Crawford and Marcus Webb, reporting that they were in the final stages of abandoning their palace headquarters. Their frustration at the failure of their expanded theft operation had turned to paranoia and desperation. They were destroying documents, dismantling equipment, and preparing to disappear before their conspiracy could be fully exposed. Morrison and Sir Edward developed a strategy that would allow the criminals to leave the palace while ensuring they could be arrested later by appropriate law enforcement agencies. Patricia would provide final intelligence about their escape plans, while Morrison would document their departure and coordinate with security services to track their movements. Around 8 in the morning, Patricia sent Morrison a message indicating that Helen and Marcus were preparing to make their final exit from the palace. They had changed into civilian clothes and were planning to leave separately to avoid attracting attention. Helen would exit through the staff entrance, while Marcus would use a maintenance exit that he knew was not closely monitored. Morrison positioned himself to observe both exits while maintaining communication with Sir Edward, who was coordinating with MI5 and Scotland Yard to ensure the criminals could be apprehended once they left palace grounds. The involvement of national security agencies was necessary, given the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy and its potential implications for royal protection. As Helen Crawford approached the staff entrance, Morrison observed her carrying a small suitcase that likely contained essential personal items and possibly some evidence that could be used against her accomplices. Her demeanor showed the strain of the failed operation, but she maintained enough composure to avoid attracting attention from other staff members. Marcus Webb's exit through the maintenance area was more nervous and hurried. Morrison watched him struggle with the unfamiliar civilian clothing and repeatedly check over his shoulder as if expecting to be pursued. His years of loyal service to the palace had clearly not prepared him for a life as a fugitive from justice. Both criminals successfully left the palace grounds without incident, unaware that their movements were being tracked by undercover security personnel who had been positioned throughout the surrounding area. Morrison felt a sense of satisfaction at seeing the conspiracy finally unravel, but he knew that significant work remained to address the security vulnerabilities that had made the theft possible. Patricia Somerville's situation required careful handling to ensure her safety and cooperation in any future legal proceedings. Morrison met with her privately to explain that her assistance in resolving the crisis would be taken into account, but she would still face consequences for her participation in the initial theft. "Patricia," Morrison said gently, "your cooperation has been essential in preventing a much larger disaster. While there will be legal consequences for your actions, your willingness to help recover the coronation garment and prevent further thefts will be significant factors in your favor." Patricia nodded with resignation and relief. "I know I made terrible decisions, Captain. The guilt has been overwhelming. If testifying against Helen and the others can help prevent this from happening to anyone else, I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary." Morrison spent the remainder of the morning working with palace security officials to implement immediate improvements to the vulnerabilities that had been exploited by the criminals. New protocols were established for staff credential security, surveillance systems were upgraded in critical areas, and background check procedures were enhanced for all personnel with access to sensitive locations. The coronation garment was returned to its proper place in the Queen's wardrobe after undergoing careful examination to ensure it had not been damaged during its brief captivity. Expert conservators confirmed that the criminals had indeed taken extraordinary care to preserve the artifact, suggesting that they understood its historical significance and potential value to collectors of stolen art. By midday, Morrison received confirmation that both Helen Crawford and Marcus Webb had been arrested by plainclothes officers in separate locations around London. The evidence collected from their storage unit provided prosecutors with extensive documentation of their conspiracy and would likely result in substantial prison sentences for both individuals. The remaining members of their criminal network were identified through documents found in the storage unit and were arrested over the following days. The operation had been larger and more sophisticated than even Morrison had initially realized, involving connections to international art theft rings and underground markets for stolen historical artifacts. Most importantly, the Queen's state visit to France proceeded as scheduled without any disruption or public awareness of the crisis that had been narrowly averted. The coronation garment was worn during the diplomatic ceremonies as planned, and the flawless execution of the royal duties reinforced the stability and dignity of the monarchy. In the weeks that followed, Morrison received commendations from the highest levels of government for his handling of the crisis. The successful resolution without public disclosure was seen as a model for how sensitive security matters should be managed to protect both national interests and institutional reputations. Sir Edward Whitmore personally thanked Morrison for his exceptional service during a private ceremony attended by senior palace officials. "Captain Morrison," he said, "your dedication and professionalism during this crisis exemplify the finest traditions of royal service. The crown and the nation are in your debt." Morrison reflected on the case as a reminder that even the most secure institutions remain vulnerable to well-planned attacks by determined criminals. The theft of the coronation garment had revealed weaknesses in palace security that had existed for years without detection. Addressing these vulnerabilities would require ongoing vigilance and continuous improvement of protective measures. The case also demonstrated the importance of maintaining discretion and professionalism when dealing with sensitive security matters. Morrison's ability to resolve the crisis without public exposure had protected the monarchy's reputation, while ensuring that justice was served through appropriate legal channels. As Morrison returned to his regular duties protecting the royal family, he carried with him the knowledge that his service during those crucial days had helped preserve not just a priceless historical artifact, but the dignity and security of an institution that represented centuries of British tradition and continuity. The coronation garment had been saved, the criminals had been brought to justice, and the crown's honor remained intact.